Happy Monday, students. This week we're going to be learning about histograms and calculating mean. This is going to prepare you for the project you will all be working on next week for the Depression Awareness Day program the school is putting on next Friday. So today you'll be learning about what a histogram is and how to create one. So let's start by getting out the supplies you're going to need during this video. You're going to need a pencil to take notes, a highlighter to highlight the vocabulary words and any important ideas, and you're going to need your math notebook, which is where you're going to be taking notes, and a piece of graph paper. You'll be using this graph paper to complete the practice problems, and you'll be turning it in tomorrow into the homework bin. So let's take some time to pause this video so you can get the supplies you need, and then press play again when you have everything you need so we can get started. First, let's review what we learned before about data sets. So on the left, we see a list of all the test scores from a class that took a test on October 1st. On the right, we have transferred the information into a chart. Here, all the test scores fall into a category based on how we broke down the scores. Do you remember us talking about this last week? Great. We have learned different ways to display that information. We have used the information to make pie charts. Here we total up the number of students, divide the pie into slices, and then color the slices needed for each category of test scores. So that's what you guys see on the right. Next, we learned how to create a bar graph from the data we put in the chart. This time we created bars on a graph that represented the number of students that fell into each category. Does everyone remember the example we did last Friday? Okay, great. So today we're going to learn another way to display information, and that is called a histogram. A histogram is a form of bar graph that shows the frequency of the data value sets in intervals of the same size. The height of the bar represents the frequency of the values in the interval. The intervals are continuous. In other words, there are no gaps in the categories in which we are putting the data into. Let's look at the test data chart again. See on the left the score? The groups that those are in are called intervals. So let's think about it. Can we use this data to create a histogram? Well, let's think back to what the definition of a histogram is and decide. A histogram, as per the definition, has intervals of the same size. So let's take a look at the intervals on the chart on the right. So the interval between 100 and 90 is 11, right? Because there are 11 scores that can fit in there. The interval between 80 and 89 is 10 scores. So there are 10 possible scores that can fit in there. And the interval between 0 and 39 is 40 because there are 40 possible scores that can fit in there. So all these intervals are different. Therefore, we cannot use this data as it is to create a histogram. So let's figure out how we can create a histogram from the test data that we have. We know that the intervals need to be the same size, right? So here are the test scores from the test on October 1st. How can I create equal intervals to distribute the scores into? So we can see that the lowest score is 36. And we can see that the highest score is 96. So we can create intervals of 10, but we can start at 36 and end at 96. In creating these intervals, we can distribute the test data to see the frequency in which test scores fall into each of these intervals. So you can see the interval like 36 to 46, there's one test score that fits in there. From 46 to 56, there are 3. From 56 to 66, there are 3. From 66 to 76, there are 9. From 76 to 86, there are 12. And from 86 to 96, there are 8. So looking at these new intervals and frequency, we can create a histogram of this data. Notice in this histogram, there are no gaps between the bars or the intervals. It's a continuous line of data starting at 36 and ending at 96. So now you will need your graph paper because we are going to work on some practice problems. You will be turning this in tomorrow in class, so make sure your name's on it. Okay? Here's problem number 1. Can you make a histogram with the following data set? This chart here represents the number of the number of pairs of shoes owned by students in a math class. So the first thing we should look at is the interval. The intervals must be equal. So looking between 1 and 3, we see 3. Between 4 and 6 is 3. Between 7 and 9 is 3. Between 10 and 12 is 3. And between 13 and 15 is 3. And they have to be continuous, right? Are any numbers between the first and last number skipped? No. Every number between 3 and 15 is represented. So the answer is yes, you can make a histogram from this data. So on your graph paper, I want you to create a histogram for this data set. Pause this video now to complete your work and then press play when you're done, and we will review this question. You should all have completed the histogram representing the number of pairs of shoes owned by students in this math class. We determined that the interval for each of these graphs would be 3, and it should start at 1 and end at 15. Here is what the histogram should look like. You can see that the numbers across the bottom are continuous and there are no gaps between the bars. You can see between 7 and 9 there are 0 students, so we have to show that with just the gap showing 0. That interval is 0. If you guys are having any problems, write down your questions in your notebook and we will ask for questions tomorrow in class. Now we're going to work on some think about it problems. Remember to write down your answers on the graph paper you are turning in tomorrow. What are the differences between a bar graph and a histogram? Press pause and write down what makes them different. Refer to your notes if you need help, and then press play when you are done. Now that you finished number 2, try number 3. Remember, we are still writing the answers on your graph paper. For number 3, I want you to create your own scenario where you could gather data and it would be possible to display the results using a histogram. You do not have to draw the histogram. I just want to know the question you would set out to answer and how you would chart that information so you could create a histogram from that chart. Remember, in order to create a histogram, your data must be in equal intervals. Let me show you an example. Using the example from earlier, my question would be, how many pairs of shoes do the students in Algebra 1 own? That's the first part of question 3. The second part is to set up the chart I would use to create the histograph from. Here is my chart. You can see that the data would be distributed into intervals of 3 with no numbers missing from the beginning, which is the beginning is 1 and it ends at 15. Now you need to create your own question and chart setup. Press pause to complete this and then come back and press play when you are done. Welcome back. You should now have 3 practice problems completed on your graph paper. So here's what to do next. Tomorrow, which is Tuesday, you will be turning in your practice problems. There is a histogram worksheet in Google Classroom. You will need to complete that worksheet on a separate sheet of paper. This is going to be due on Wednesday. There will also be a video on calculating mean that I'm going to put up in Google Classroom. You will need to take notes in your math notebook. Just a reminder, your notebooks are being checked next week, so remember this is graded. After you watch the video, you will need to complete the Calculating Mean worksheet from Google Classroom. This is also going to be done on a separate sheet of paper, and this is due on Thursday. Finally, there will be a quiz that I'm going to put up in Google Classroom that you must complete by 5 p.m. on Friday. I'm going to close it at 5, so it needs to be done. This quiz will cover information on histograms and calculating mean. If you guys have any questions, please bring them with you to class tomorrow. And I'll see you in class tomorrow.